out was that practice and recovery are completely congruent. But there are some slight differences, and I didn't feel a need to translate, the big book into Buddhist language or even the 12 steps. They work just the way they are, and they've worked for millions of people around the world. I've been to these international conferences where 90 flags come out on stage. Those are from Buddhist countries, Jewish countries, Muslim countries where people are using the big book to get sober. But let me just give you an example of a little bit of a difference. In the fourth step, we talk about character defects. And in Buddhism, we don't really talk about sin or character defects. In my Buddhist practice, I'm not trying to get rid of large chunks of myself or become somebody different. So in Buddhism, we don't talk about sin, that we've sinned or that we're flawed, although, of course, we're not perfect, but we talk about ignorance. So the Buddhist practice offers 10 precepts, and these precepts also are the opposite of alcoholism. And I think if we study these precepts, they can really inform the fourth step and the fifth step and making amends to people we've harmed. The Buddha said that if we really understood that our unskillful actions that cause suffering come from ignorance, we wouldn't do them. If I knew that when I lie, that these are the precepts: when I lie, when I steal, when I intoxicate my mind, when I misuse sexuality, there are 10 precepts like this, that when I do those things, I cause suffering to myself and others. If I really understood that, I probably wouldn't do them. And so I've worked the steps with AA sponsors by the book, by the big book. And yet I think about how keeping the Buddhist precepts in mind, turning my will and my life over to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, how that reflects back and enriches my recovery. And I think that's probably a good example. And somebody asked me, well, what teachings have I learned in Buddhism that have enriched my recovery? They're in, I hate to plug my book, but they're in my book. So, we have the 6 paramitas, we have the 8 worldly winds. These teachings are in the book, and I do talk about those teachings, these Buddhist teachings, from the point of view of recovery. So one of the 6 paramitas is patience. And patience is something we also learn in recovery. So a very important aspect of Zen practice is we don't do it with a gaining idea. We don't sit down to become a perfect meditator or to accrue merit or to, even, as I've said, even to become a better person. We just sit down to be who we are. However, I'll let you in on a little secret, that if you do this frequently, like every day or frequently, sit down silently for 20 minutes or 40 minutes, and it's very helpful to do that with other people, your life will begin to change in ways you can't even sometimes comprehend or see. So that's a paradox about Zen. We don't sit down to get anything. And yet, of course, something happens when we sit. I recommend a wonderful book called Buddha's Brain by Rick Hanson. And he talks about the studies of how meditation helps us in so many ways, helps our brain health in so many ways. And that book will tell you a lot about how meditation can enhance your life. And I think for a lot of people, they say, well, I don't have time to meditate. We always have time to take 3 deep breaths. You can do it at a stoplight. You can do it when your phone rings. Have something to remind you to do that. You can do it when you hear the alarm go off in the morning. And you'll be surprised how transformative 3 deep breaths are. Let's do it right now. I used to do this with my class, my 3rd graders. I'd ring this bell and we'd take 3 deep breaths. Take a moment to appreciate how you feel right now. And I do feel that the welding together or the weaving together of Buddhist practice and recovery is happening all over the country. And when I started that in 1985, it was very controversial in Buddhist circles. You don't need anything but Buddhist practice. I used to cook for the guests at the Zen monastery during the summer, and I was sober in 1986 when I went there, and I asked if I could put a little note on the gate to the monastery saying, "Friends of Bill W., see Laura in the kitchen." And I had to really talk the staff into letting me do that. I said, I need this. And there will be other people here that need it too. So in 1985 was when Zen Center started to get open to the idea that people in recovery need recovery if they're going to practice Buddhism. And I think this is a truth that's really starting to take hold across the country. I would say a really important thing about working a fourth step and a fifth step is to do it with the sponsor. So recovery, we're all here because two men had a conversation in 1935. Isn't that incredible? And so recovery is spread from warm hand to warm hand, one person reaching out to another. And Buddhism is also one spread from warm hand to warm hand. So we do this in community. We do this in Sangha. We recover together. And a sponsor can really help us understand what the nature of the harm that we've done. But I would say one thing that's very important to remember when working a fourth and fifth step is to keep in mind the principle of forgiveness. And there's a chapter in my book about the healing power of forgiveness. So as you make a list of the people you've harmed, keep yourself in mind, the way that you've harmed yourself, and the ignorance or the suffering that caused you to cause that harm. In Buddhism, we say, all my ancient twisted karma from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. And so one thing that we know in Buddhism is that we take responsibility for the ways in which we harm others. And we also recognize that because of our family history, because of our country's history, there are conditions and factors that have influenced us that we have no way of even knowing about. And that is a way to forgive ourselves. We can change our behavior, but some of our harmful behavior came out of forces beyond our control. And there's a wonderful book called Struggle for Intimacy. I'm sure many of you grew up in alcoholic homes. In the back of that book, there are 13 characteristics that people who grew up with alcoholism have. And I really got to know myself and understand that alcoholism, as a family disease and as a cultural disease, that I'm part of that. It's not just me. I'm part of this karma of alcoholism. And so later in the steps, we say, if we're going to ask for forgiveness when we make amends, shouldn't we first forgive completely? And I would say, shouldn't we also forgive ourselves? So Teresa, I think that this open to do the fourth and fifth step in an open-hearted way, with the wisdom of another human being, your trusted sponsor, that in Buddhism, we have our Buddhist teachers that we can work with as well. I did a fifth step with my Buddhist teacher. But to keep in your heart forgiveness for yourself and others, I think that changes the flavor of our step work. There's a phrase in the Big Book: upon awakening, we consider the hours ahead. And we start the day with the intention of being uh, living the principles of recovery throughout the day. And then when we retire, we look back on the day and we think about, this is like this is a mental 10 step. We can also write this down. Was there anything that we did today that I need to attend to? Was there anything that's going to haunt me that I need to take care of? Anything with my thoughts or my mind, with my thoughts or my speech or my deeds that I need to pay attention to? Well, the Dalai Lama, I wish I had it at hand. He says, upon awakening, we think, I'm so happy to have woken up. I am a human being. I have the opportunity as a human being to open my hearts to other people and to work tirelessly for the benefit of all beings. Those are exactly the same thing, you know. So both recovery and Buddhism are about waking up. And, you know, I'm thinking again of George's question about practice and recovery. So much of our recovery, and it's all throughout the big book, is about self-acceptance. And when we sit, just sit to be, as you put it, there's tremendous self-acceptance in that. We sit down just in the way that we are. So that inventory at the end of the day is congruent with both Buddhism and recovery. So in behaviors, you know, we have to keep eating. We have to keep, you know, we want to have sex, of course. So how do we do those things in balance? That was your question, right? So how can our practice inform that when we need to keep doing those things? There's another book I'll recommend called The Compass of Pleasure by, I think it's Daniel Linden. He points out that this is also about brain science. When we engage in our addictions, you probably all know this, you get this kind of dopamine response. When you look at your cell phone, you get a dopamine response. When you get an email, you get a dopamine response. That's why it's addictive. There are 12-step groups now for people with screen addiction. And so in changing our lives, in going in a more wholesome direction, we need to do wholesome things. And many of the wholesome things that we can turn towards also give us a dopamine response. Not that that's why we should do them. So we get this dopamine response from vodka, from orgasm, from marijuana, from food that we love. We get these dopamine responses. But we also get this dopamine response from learning. Just learning a new language or doing some kind of intellectual activity, expressing our creativity, being in nature, physical exercise, generosity. If when we put money in the basket in a meeting, we get a dopamine response. And here's an interesting thing. Even if we contribute to a favorite charity anonymously or without anybody knowing it, we get a dopamine response. So this is kind of a scientific way of saying, if we're going to replace our unwholesome, self-destructive habits, if we're going to move away from those, we need to replace them with wholesome, life-affirming habits that also give us pleasure. And I don't know about you, but one of the great gifts of recovery to me is that very simple things give me pleasure now. You know, seeing a cherry tree in bloom, running into I used to teach third grade, running into one of my students in Golden Gate Park, who's now an adult and remembers me. You know, paying a parking ticket when I get it instead of waiting till they mount up. That might sound funny, but even doing the dishes can be a pleasurable experience if we are happy that we've woken up to this life. Great. Yeah, I first saw this quote on taped to the bathroom mirror of a friend of mine. And it's so precious to me that I read it frequently. Every day, think as you wake up. Today, I am fortunate to be alive. I have a precious human life. I am not going to waste it. I'm going to use all my energies to develop myself, to expand my heart out to others, to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. I'm going to have kind thoughts towards others. I'm not going to get angry or think badly about others. I'm going to benefit others as much as I can. Now you might say, easy for you to say, Dalai Lama, but but actually, the Dalai Lama, if you've ever seen him speak, has such a wonderful, human, humble sense of humor. He struggles with anger every single day, right? So this is an intention we have. And to achieve enlightenment sounds like a lofty goal, but you could say just to be fully ourselves is to be enlightened. So I love that. I love that quote. You know, I also want to tell you, I wanted to write this book for a long time because I've been giving lectures on Buddhism and recovery for 20 years. But I didn't see how I could do it without breaking my anonymity. And so we're in 12-step programs, and you know that I am as well. And I feel good about this. In my book, I never mentioned well, in the back, I have interviews with people in recovery in AA, but I wanted to maintain my anonymity at the level of the press. So I called World Services in New York, and I said, I want to write a book about Buddhism and recovery. If I talk about recovery in a general way, am I in line with the promises? And the woman there said, yes, of course. Of course, I guide people towards the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction in the book. And there are these anonymous voices from AA in the back. So it's a little bit tricky for me. I want to hold to the traditions. I also want to make these teachings beneficial to other people. Incidentally, the woman at World Services, when I told her about it, she said, oh, I'm a Buddhist. Let me know when your book comes out. We've come a long way since 1935. So I feel like there's so much more available to us now in recovery and in getting well, including therapy, including important therapy. And I imagine people are enlightened enough now about recovery that if, I would say to answer that question, feel your way, see how it feels, get the feeling of the place. You might, if you speak to a teacher there, that should be held in confidence. Whether you want to come out as an NA person to the community at large would be a decision you'd make once you feel comfortable there. At Zen Center at our Monday night meeting, we say, who you see here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. So we do want that meeting we don't go around telling, hey, guess who I saw in the recovery meeting, right? I hope people do honor that request.